this one. Good, good. I'm glad.
I'm sorry, I wrote in purple. I color code all my classes, and this class ended up being purple.
Yeah, it's really okay. It's no more difficult for me to read purple than any other color. So before we start, I do just want to quickly ask, right? How many of you are having trouble getting a copy of your Hands on the Shaw play for next time? Okay, just you?
Probably.
So that's the play that's in the set of plays by...
Yeah.
Okay, I think I got that one.
Okay. Yeah, I saw that they did have a physical copy. So so if you are not able to get a copy of the play, let me know and I will arrange an alternative text for you, right? I'll get something together for you. It will be Candida. You won't be reading something else, right? But yeah, I'll get something to you. Okay. I also just want to remind everybody quickly as well that your first vocab quiz is going to be due on Sunday nights. It's already written. It is posted to Georgia View. It'll open up tomorrow morning. It'll be available till Sunday at midnight. I'll send everybody a reminder on Sunday to make sure that everybody takes it. So any questions about the vocab quiz or about upcoming assignments or anything else? Yeah, Hannah.
Is the vocab quiz, I don't know if you can answer this, but is it just like multiple choice, or is it like words from like our book?
It'll be short answer.
Okay.
So it'll be a combination of terms specifically from the text
Okay.
and terms that we talk about in class. Like
Okay.
basically like things that I want you to remember for the exams and for future classes. Right?
Okay. Thank you.
Yep, no problem.
Is that Frederick Chopin or Europe?
Chopin.
Okay, Chopin.
Chopin, yes.
That makes more sense.
And yeah, and this, I was playing the Chopin Nocturne because this is what Dorian is playing on the piano for Lord Henry in chapter 19 in their final meeting. A nocturne, for those of you who don't know, is a piece of music that is intended to evoke the night. All right, so I guess we might as well kind of start here with the quiz question, and we'll kind of just maybe go from there. What did y'all think of this? About Dorian's death, about the way the novel ends, and its relationship to ideas of art in the novel.
It told me the kind of period. It's not. Wilde didn't live in the he lived in the Romantic period, but it felt like a very romantic ending.
Okay, and indeed, the decadents are often kind of called the last romantics. So there's a lot of romantic influence in the literature of the 1880s and the 1890s, although it's tempered with a weird kind of classicism as well. But yeah, and I think, again, I want to remind everybody too that one of the big influences on Wilde is Keats, right? Keats was his favorite poet. So yeah, there are heavy doses of romanticism at work here. Yeah, go ahead.
So throughout the whole novel, it kind of plays with, we see, people make comments, like Lord Henry makes comments about art, how it's unimportant, but it is important, or living life and having experiences and feeling emotions are important to making good art, but is art really important to living life? And I think, Dorian's death being, him trying to destroy the painting of him, and in turn destroying himself, kind of plays that, art, it answers the question. Art is important to life. It serves as a reflection or a representation of oneself. And Dorian, being like many people, was unable to handle that truth about what he had become, and he couldn't handle his own reflection. Like, right before he kills himself, he smashes the mirror.
Yeah, he smashes this fancy mirror that Lord Henry gave him.
Right,
Yeah.
he smashes the mirror because
And then
he
he
couldn't
attacks
handle
the
his
painting.
reflection.
Yeah. Okay.
So I think art, or what the novel is telling us, is that art is a reflection of ourselves. And if you're killing art, or if you're destroying it, is it really destroying the thing itself, or is it destroying your own conscience?
Yeah, and one thing that I think we might want to think about here, right? When Dorian attacks the painting, what's the thing that survives? The painting, or yeah, the painting survives and Dorian dies, right? So the painting is the piece of art is the actual permanent thing. Right, and much as Lord Henry pointed out to Dorian in their first meeting, right? It's the human body, it's personal beauty and youth that are the things that actually fade and pass away and die, right? Art is permanent.
It's like a living conscience, a living representation of humanity and what it has become, that it doesn't go away. While the person itself that may be reflected in it may grow old and die, the art itself will be preserved. There's paintings in museums all over the world, texts and things that have been preserved, and what they reflect is still here. The people they reflect are gone. I think that's
but
kind
the
of
ideas persist, yeah. So how many of you are familiar with this word? It's a Greek word, Nemesis. Is this familiar to any of y'all?
Mimicry.
Okay, yeah, you're thinking along the right lines here. What does a mimic do?
Copies your every move.
Yeah, a mimic imitates, right? It imitates you, it copies you. So mimesis is a Greek word that means imitation. And mimesis is the basis for most ancient theories of art. Right, so Plato and Aristotle, for example, both view all art as imitation, right? Plato thinks it's bad because you're just imitating other things that are inferior imitations of ideas, right? So art is a kind of third order imitation and thus, inherently shitty. Whereas Aristotle is really just concerned kind of like with whether it's a good imitation or a bad imitation, right? But yeah, so the ancients argued that all art was essentially a form of imitation. And that art, thus, according to mimetic theories, on some level imitates life. Now, one of the things that Wilde argued, not just in this novel but in his criticism, was that it actually goes the other way around, right? That it's not art that imitates life, it's life that imitates art. Right? Art presents us with an ideal that we try to live up to. Right? We want to be like the things that we admire. So, for example, like this is a non-value laden example, right? But he notes that, that people don't talk about the London fog or complain about London fog because London is actually foggy all the time. They talk about it because they've read about it in novels and they've seen it in paintings, right? So they assume that this is what London is like. It's foggy. And I think, Dorian's painting is supposed to be a kind of beautiful ideal to live up to, right? And it does end up being something that he lives up to, right? But as the painting degenerates, so does he. Yeah, he becomes more and more debauched, right? In fact, does he seem to be able to reverse the decay of the image in the painting?
I think that so in the beginning, the first few chapters, between Lord Henry and Basil, they talk about, promises. Like the three of them are having that discussion, and I think Basil says that, Henry won't like Dorian anymore for keeping promises. In fact, he actually won't like him as much.
Yeah.
And from that point forward, we consistently see Dorian break promises. whether it's a promise to meet somebody for lunch, or a promise to himself to do better, to do good.
Or a promise to marry Sybil Vane, right? Yeah.
After that point, once that statement is said, we consistently see him break promises to himself and to others.
Yeah. And I think it's also worth examining the way he tends to kind of center his own moral universe, right, in his universe of feeling, right? For example, when Sybil Vane commits suicide, is he complaining about her suffering and how painful it must have been for her to swallow that prussic acid? Or is he complaining about the pain she put him through by acting badly? By subjecting him to bad art, right?
Up until the point that she died, like he finds out that she's actually dead.
Yeah.
We see him talk about, the pain he put her
Oh,
through.
you don't know how I suffered, yeah.
But then, as soon as he finds out that she's dead, it's all about him. It's right back to him and his pain and what he went through.
And then the pattern repeats itself when he kills Basil, right? It's like, you don't know what he made me suffer. It's never about the victim, right?
Because he is the victim.
Yeah.
He wants to be the victim.
He's the victim of other people's misunderstanding, or really, in some ways, like the victim of their art, right? Whether it's good or bad. And I think that like some of this is, maybe there's a kind of class critique here as well, because we see something similar happen when the Duchess of Monmouth's brother accidentally shoots James Vane. Right? Before Dorian even realizes who's been killed.
Also, Geoffrey Monmouth, that sounds like a familiar name.
Yeah, Geoffrey of Monmouth is the guy who wrote that fake history of the kings of Britain. That much of the King Arthur legend is drawn from. We talked about him in Fantasy Lit last semester. Yeah, if we turn to page 171 here, it's in chapter 18, for those of you who are in a different edition. Dorian is talking about, the shooting being a bad omen. Right. What is? Asked Lord Henry. This accident, I suppose. My dear fellow, it can't be helped. It was the man's own fault. Why did he get in front of the guns? Besides, it is nothing to us. It is rather awkward for Geoffrey, of course. It does not do to pepper beaters. It makes people think that one is a wild shot. And Geoffrey is not. He shoots very straight. But there is no use talking about the matter, right? There's no pity here for the dead man, right? For the victim of Geoffrey's wild shot. All the pity is for the guy who did the killing. Yeah, go ahead.
I have to bring up this part because I couldn't stop laughing. It was kind of after that, and it was when Lord Henry said, "Now, if Geoffrey had done the thing on purpose, how interesting he would be. I should like to know someone who had committed a real murder."
Yeah.
I was dying. I couldn't stop laughing. And then the red was like, "I gotta go. I don't feel well again."
Yeah.
Like, because here's a real murder.
Yeah, exactly. The joke is on Lord Henry, right? Who thinks he knows so much of life, and he thinks he knows so much of the world, right? But how much does he really know about his best friend? Yeah, Dorian has this whole other life locked away that Lord Henry has absolutely no clue about. So I think that, that's also some indication of the level of seriousness with which we're supposed to treat Lord Henry and his theories, right? That he's got theories about everything. He stands back and observes everything. But he doesn't actually know what is going on. So Lord Henry, and to an extent Dorian, are both examples of a fairly typical 19th century personality. Right? They are what are often called dandies. And a dandy is a recognizable figure in 19th century Anglo-American culture, right? So they tend to be, on the one hand, really ostentatious in their dress, right? They wear really ostentatious clothing. Clothing that's not necessarily in good taste, but is designed to get them noticed, right? To make people look at them. So, for example, early in Wilde's career, he once wore a coat to a party that was designed to look like a cello. Mostly just so that people would notice him and talk and ask about his coat, right? And they are also typically witty social critics and to an extent outsiders. Right? They're outsiders, like maybe observers actually is a better word than outsiders, because they don't actually stand that far outside their society, kind of just far enough to offer a witty critique. So Wilde is actually a kind of outsider in England in a couple of ways, right? One, he's not English, right? He's Irish. He belongs to a class that we refer to as the Anglo-Irish ascendancy. And they're a kind of upper middle class in Ireland of Irish people who are Protestant in religion and of English descent, right? So many of these families are, several generations old in Ireland, Wilde's family being one of them. And some of them kind of enter the ranks of the minor nobility, but most of them are kind of in the upper middle classes, right? So for example, Wilde's father was an eye surgeon. So he comes from the professional classes rather than from the aristocracy. Right? He's also more or less openly gay, but coy about it, right? At the same time that he is as open as one could be about one's sexuality in Britain in the 1890s, he's also a married man with 2 sons, right? So yeah, go ahead.
Didn't he die? I could be thinking of somebody else. Didn't he die from like syphilis or something? Maybe I'm getting it wrong.
He dies relatively young in Paris. I think he's 45, I think, when he dies. And I'm not sure if the actual cause of death was syphilis, but he was rumored to have had syphilis.
Okay, yeah.
To have contracted it from a prostitute when he was an undergraduate. But yeah, so he is somebody who kind of stands on the edge of polite society in a couple of ways, right? And one way to it, so the level at which he can get away with breaking society's rules, while still being accepted by it, right? Those are boundaries that he enjoys testing, right? And the dandy, as a figure, isn't someone who so much breaks the rules. The dandy kind of comments on what the rules and conventions are. And might offer critiques of them, but never really oversteps them. So this would be somebody, so Lord Henry would be a good example of this, right? Somebody who says these outrageous things in order to be noticed, but otherwise seems to lead a fairly conventional life. Now Dorian is this on the surface, right? but beneath, he really is consorting with prostitutes and going to opium dens and, leading people down the primrose path to sin, right? So, where was I going with this?
I just find him to be very entertaining.
Uh-huh.
I like Lord Henry. I like his wife, and I like his uncle.
Yeah.
They're just very
Yeah.
entertaining characters, and I
Mhm.
love that his uncle has that little cameo at the very end where he's the one on the sidewalk
Yeah.
the night that Dorian dies. It cracked me up.
Yeah.
It was great.
Yeah, he knows more about Dorian's life than his nephew, Dorian's great friend, does, right? And I think one thing to point out too is that, like, at the end of the novel, Dorian and Henry are both still, like, neither of them are old men, right? Dorian dies at about age 40, and Henry's about 40, is about, like, 48, 50, right? So, given Dorian's appearance at the end of his life, like, he's been living hard.
I think that, talking about, this personality or this type of person that they embody,
Uh-huh.
Lord Henry and his wife are, like you said, that on the surface, where Dorian is that. He truly is it. They play it being that. They put on, the coat or the mask of that.
Yeah.
But he actually is it.
Yeah. Well, and that's what this is, basically, is a pose, right? It's a self-conscious pose. And the dandy has the authority to critique social convention and moral conventions, in part because he still abides by them, right? He doesn't actually threaten them. Whereas what Dorian does...
Takes it a step further.
Yeah. Dorian actually kind of moves into genuine crime, right? Even before he has murdered Basil. And in fact, there's a passage I want to go to on page, it's on page 179 in this edition. It is in chapter 19. I think it's, where Dorian asks Lord Henry what he would say if he found out that Dorian had murdered Basil, right? So can I get somebody to read for us that paragraph that starts with, "I would say, my dear fellow."
I would say, my dear fellow, that you are posing for a character that doesn't suit you. All crime is vulgar, just as all vulgarity is crime. It is not in you, Dorian, to commit a murder. I am sorry if I hurt your vanity by saying so, but I assure you it is true. Crime belongs exclusively to the lower orders. I don't blame them in the smallest degree. I should fancy that crime was to them what art is to us, simply a method of procuring extraordinary sensations.
So, what do you make of this idea here? Right? So, where art is being compared to crime. How are art and crime alike in Lord Henry's phrase here?
To him, it's kind of a reflection of your status or your state.
Okay, yeah.
He relates it to the classes and
Uh-huh.
what your state of being is in life or your state in the system. And if you are in the upper levels, then obviously you're an artist. You have something to do with art. But if you're lower, then crime is just part of your life. It's part of your status.
Uh-huh.
It is your representation of where you're at.
Yes, I think you're right. He is making that kind of class distinction here, right? That art is what rich sophisticates do, and crime is what the vulgar do, right? What were you going to say, Hannah?
I was going to say, he was talking about pleasure, like getting pleasure from art. So like whenever you get pleasure from something, you want to keep doing it.
Uh-huh.
So if you like committed crimes, you get pleasure from it, you keep doing it, just like how art is.
So yeah, not only is there class distinction, these are sources of pleasure, right? means of procuring sensation. And art, in Lord Henry's reading, I think this is the really kind of interesting thing about it, right? He's sort of suggesting here that art is just crying for more sophisticated palates, right? That there's something a little bit underhanded, a little bit naughty about both of these things.
A lot of artists, whether it be, literary or, like actual paintings, makes fun of things that are happening. They make fun of, like, the people, like, just make fun of everybody.
Yeah.
Nothing is really safe in the spectrum of art.
I mean, generally, safe art is bad art, right? Art that doesn't make you question anything, that doesn't make you think about anything, that, doesn't move you in any particular way, right? Or, doesn't, tweak society's nose in any particular way. Yeah, it's often, like a Thomas Kincaid Hallmark card, right? So that sort of thing. But I think there's an idea I want to introduce here to you that I think that Wilde is working with. And that I think that Lord Henry is channeling in some sense here, whether it's to be critiqued or whether it's sincere, we'll kind of we'll get to. But have any of you ever heard of Matthew Arnold? He was a Victorian poet and critic.
The name is vaguely familiar.
Okay, so Matthew Arnold is one of the central literary figures of the mid-19th century. And he writes a book in 1869. Okay, well, really compiles a book from earlier essays he'd written and published. Called Culture and Anarchy. And there are two big ideas in that book that I think that Wilde is incorporating into this novel. Right? One is Arnold's notion that religion in England is on its way out as a unifying force. And that what Arnold calls culture, so that is, like appreciation of art, appreciation of poetry, appreciation of, fiction, things of that nature, right? That culture will become a replacement for religion as a kind of social glue. People will go to the art museum or to the theater as they once went to church. It's an idea that probably seemed less absurd in 1869 than it does now. The other idea of Arnold's that I think Wilde is drawing on here is his description of kind of like what the two poles of art and behavior are, right? So Arnold gives us these terms, Hellenism and Hebraism, to describe the intellectual tenor of a given society. So Hellenism, right? Hellenism, of course, refers to Greek culture and Greek ideals. And it is, on the one hand, personal. It's based on self-knowledge and individual will. And its key modes are observation and reflection. Right, so Hellenism is primarily about sort of forming your own personality and your own ideas through interactions with the world around you, right? Hebraism, its opposite, is concerned primarily with fear of God and keeping the commandments. So, thus, with obedience to some kind of external authority. Right? Whether that external authority is God, whether it's the state, whether it's simply society's good opinion, right? In Hebraism, what matters is that you're obeying something outside of yourself and your own perceptions. So while Hellenism is personal, Hebraism is social. And Arnold argues that historically, kind of like eras seesaw back and forth between these two tendencies, right? So he sees, for example, the Renaissance, where there's a great opening up of expression, and the rediscovery of the Greek classics and all that, right? As a Hellenistic age. Whereas his own age, the Victorian era, he thinks of as primarily Hebraic, right? Because the middle classes and their conventional morality are ascendant. And so I think that this balance, right, of tendencies is something that Wilde is commenting on in this particular novel, right? And exploring in some ways kind of the limitations of both. So this is just an idea that I wanted to introduce to y'all. I don't know if you want to do anything with it just yet. But I think this is something that, particularly as we're talking about modernism as a kind of development out of Victorian materials, these are also ideas that we should probably be aware of. Now, the other thing that's going on here that I think is directly related to this notion of art and crime both being sources of pleasure. I want to go back to a chapter that you read for last time that we didn't really talk much about. It's the one in which Dorian is collecting editions of his favorite book in different colors. And what's the entirety of that chapter kind of given over? Like, is collecting new copies of this, like other copies of this book, the only thing he's doing in this chapter? The only thing that's cataloged in this chapter. That's chapter 11. So let's turn to it's page 112 in this edition. I want to start here with a paragraph that begins, it was rumored of him once that he was about to join the Roman Catholic Communion. And I'll find it if somebody could read that paragraph for me.
128 in my version. It was rumored of him once that he was about to join the Roman Catholic Communion. And certainly the Roman ritual had always a great attraction for him. The daily sacrifice, more awful really than all the sacrifices of the antique world, stirred him as much by its superb rejection of the evidence of the senses as by the primitive simplicity of its elements and the eternal pathos of the human tragedy that it sought to symbolize. He loved to kneel down on the cold marble pavement and watch the priest in his stiff flowered dalmatic, slowly and with white hands moving aside the veil of the tabernacle, or raising aloft the jeweled lantern-shaped monstrance with the pallid water that at times one would fain think is indeed the panis celestis, the bread of angels, or robed in garments of the passion of Christ, breaking the host into a chalice and smiting his breast for his sins. The fuming censers that the grave boys in their lace and scarlet tossed into the air like great gilt flowers had their subtle fascination for him. As he passed out, he used to look with wonder at the black confessionals and longed to sit in the dim shadow of one of them and listen to men and women whispering through the worn grating the true story of their lives.
So let's think for a minute here about what it is that attracts him about Roman Catholicism. What is he drawn to? Is it anything spiritual?
No. At least not on the surface.
Okay. So what is it that he finds fascinating about Catholicism?
The daily sacrifice.
Okay.
The beauty in it. The whole thing revolves around beauty on the
Uh-huh.
surface, and on the surface, it's talking about jeweled, lantern-shaped things,
Yeah.
and with white hands. Always goes back to like white. Everything is white, in this,
Yeah,
which is
let's-
like purity.
Yeah, well, I think I want to, like, there's a lot of white and red, especially in the last third of the book, and I want to kind of get to that in a minute.
It just keeps popping back up. But I think he's more, drawn to the beauty in it, and I think kind of how it's, what's the word I'm looking for? It's constant,
Okay.
like himself. Because
Uh-huh.
earlier in the book, Lord Henry talks about how only men of the church or members of the church keep their youth because they just repeat what they were told to say when they were younger.
Yeah, although to be fair, there Lord Henry isn't talking about the Catholic Church. He's talking about the Church of England.
Mm.
But yeah, but I think there is a connection drawn here to older spiritual practices, right? More ancient practices. But yeah, I think that you're right too. The attraction here is mostly aesthetic, right? The smell of the incense and the sight of the beautiful objects and the robes the priest wears. And, listening to the whispered secrets in the confessionals, right?
I think the veil has something to do with it too. Because
Okay.
he puts a lot of into like the veil covering his own portrait.
Uh-huh.
I actually highlighted something about that earlier. in
Well,
the
I think
book,
it's also important to note that the thing that's covering his portrait isn't just any cloth, it's a pall, it's a funeral cloth, right?
It's very fancy too.
Yeah, a very fancy funeral cloth.
I highlighted it because it just struck me as
Uh-huh.
funny how
Sure.
like it describes the detail on it.
Mm-hmm.
I think it's interesting.
But yeah, so we've got a veil here, we've got black confessionals that conceal people's bodies as they whisper their sins to the priest, right?
Isn't there something previously, or maybe after this, about how the only true salvation is in confession? I think we first see something about
Mhm.
confession when he's, wanting to, before he finds out that Sybil's dead.
Uh-huh.
Like right before that, he talks about how there's only real redemption in the confession. The confession is what makes you feel
Right.
better.
And he keeps all of his secrets close to the vest. And even when he tries to, like he teases with the idea of confession, right? Nobody believes him because he's so good looking. But I just want to kind of stick with what's going on in chapter 11 here for a second. Okay, so his attraction to Catholic ritual is to do with the physical, with the sensations attached to it, right? And then if we look on page 113, right? And so he would now study perfumes and the secrets of their manufacture, distilling heavily scented oils and burning odorous gums from the east. And then the next paragraph. At another time, he devoted himself entirely to music, and in a long latticed room with a vermilion and gold ceiling and walls of olive green lacquer, he used to give curious concerts in which mad gypsies tore wild music from little zithers, or grave yellow-shawled Tunisians plucked at the strange strings of monstrous lutes, right? So the thing I'm trying to point out here, right, is that he is kind of going through each of the senses and devoting himself entirely to particular sensory pleasures, especially those of a dangerous or irrational kind. So, I don't know if any of you have ever heard of the French poet Arthur Rimbaud. If any of you took World Lit 2, you might have looked at some Rimbaud poetry. So Rimbaud is more famous among most people for having lived, shall we say, a very interesting and adventurous life than for his poetry. But his poetry is actually also really kind of revolutionary. But in 1871, he wrote to a friend that what he was attempting in order to make himself into a poet was what he called the systematic derangement of the senses, right? That in order to make himself into an artist, he wanted to subject all of his senses to irrational, weird, mixed-up impressions. And that's the kind of thing that Dorian is doing here as well. But in Dorian, it leads not to art, but to crime. Right? It just leads him further and further into the darkness, right? I don't know, what do y'all think? Everybody still with me?
He's kind of overloading himself in a way.
Uh-huh.
It's kind of like sensory overload for a lot of it.
Yeah, and I mean, I think that
I feel like he probably did.
and I think some of this might also be occasioned by the fact that the painting does all the suffering for him, right? It's like imagine, if you could eat all of the cheesecake you wanted, right? Without stopping, and someone or something else would get the diabetes that would result, right?
It's the life imitates art. When he first sees that the painting is suffering for his actions, his immediate thought is to repent, to change, to be good, to prevent it from happening, to take it as a lesson.
Yeah.
But as it goes on, he begins to imitate that. With every mark that shows on the painting, it's another step towards him doing something even worse.
Yeah, he becomes a kind of he's a fascinated observer of the
He wants to know
painting,
how
right?
far it will actually go.
Yeah.
How much can he cause this painting to degrade itself?
Mm-hmm. And I think that we can get back to this color symbolism for a second, right? Because I think that is actually related, right? This prevalence of the colors white and red. In the latter part of the novel, right? So we see, for example, the Duchess of Monmouth. Has a red mouth and white teeth. We see Lord Henry dipping his white fingers into a red copper bowl.
It was
Yeah, a crimson pyramid of seeded strawberries. And their perforated shell-shaped spoons snowed white sugar on them.
It plays a lot with the blood on his hands.
Uh-huh.
For
Yeah.
every death he has caused or murder he's committed, it's playing a lot with the blood that is on his hands. Like the white hand going into the red bowl.
Yeah.
Or like the red covering or tainting the white.
Yeah, but we see that Lord Henry is really only kind of dipping his fingers in, right? He's not really going that deep. And, the bowl is red. The color doesn't come off on his hand, right?
Mm-hmm.
So he's just skimming the surface.
Which goes back to him, and it being like a self-conscious pose.
Uh-huh.
He's not actually doing it, he's just playing at it.
Yeah.
With the strawberries, it's kind of like the white is covering the red, like you're trying to erase it, but you can't.
Uh-huh.
Which Dorian himself does try to do.
Okay.
He cleans the knife numerous times, trying to erase it. But it's still there.
We're thinking of like the white here as purity, right? But are there other things that the color white can connote? Are there other symbolic associations we have with the color white?
This may be weird, but death.
Yeah, the whiteness of a corpse, right?
Just ghostly.
Yeah. And I think that that's probably what's going on here with the mixing of the white and the red. I think it's the white of death more than it is the white of purity, right? Or the white of mortality.
Well, a lot of times you want to think of red as you either think of, the blood and taintedness, or you think of roses.
Sure.
And we see a lot of description of nature and use of things in nature to describe people and places and things that are happening within the novel. And
Lord Henry describes Dorian's youth at the beginning of the novel as rose white and rose red.
yes. And then about right around the time Sybil dies, Dorian takes his breakfast, and there's a vase of sulfur yellow roses. So it's like the slow degradation from the white rose to the red.
Yeah, yellow being the key decadent color, right? The color of decay. So there's one last thing that I want to focus on here for a minute, and then I'll let y'all go and enjoy your weekends, at least the part of the weekend in which you're not doing homework and taking a quiz for this class. I want to talk about why we're discussing a late Victorian novel in a modernist course, right? So, do you all have any thoughts on what it is that makes this novel modern?
Maybe part of it is the language. I feel like it's not super difficult to understand. I feel like the older stuff.
Okay.
Maybe I'm.
Okay, so although Wilde does kind of show off a lot of his language learning here too. There's a lot of French words that are left untranslated. There's a lot of Latin and Greek in here as well. So yeah, it is a level of language, and this is something we'll see in other modernist texts, more explicitly modernist texts. It is, in some sense, a kind of polyglot.
And has a different feeling to it.
Okay, how so? How is this different from, say, a Dickens novel or a George Eliot novel? Those of you who are familiar with Victorian lit.
I don't know, I didn't expect to like it as much as I do.
Uh-huh.
Because when I've read other things like this in the past, it just kind of drags on.
Mm-hmm.
And it's okay, well, we're still in this one scene.
Okay.
2 chapters later, we're just past that. I don't know, it feels different.
Mm-hmm. And one thing about those long Victorian novels that I think we need to remember, one of the reasons why they're so long is because they were originally published as serials, right? Not as individual standalone texts. So The Picture of Dorian Gray was published as a short novel in one piece in Lippincott's magazine in 1890, and then in a slightly expanded form in 1891. So it isn't like that kind of, it's not the sort of thing like, where Dickens is writing Great Expectations, and he'll write, say like the first third of the book, and won't bother writing the second third of the book until he gets the public response, right? And then comes out with the next edition, and then so on and so forth until the story is finished, right? So it was almost like buying a kind of limited run magazine. It's like you buy part one, if you like part one, you buy part two, and if you like part two, you buy part three. So
I like that it's not a tragic love story.
Okay. It's
I mean, it is in a way.
Maybe the tragedy of Dorian's love for himself.
Yes, it's not like the traditional like, a Romeo and Juliet type story, since that's what they use here.
Yeah,
it's not that.
Yeah, and I mean, there's Basil's kind of idealized platonic love for Dorian, and Lord Henry's love of a good, well-turned phrase, right?
But it's not your like what we're trained to think of as a traditional love story like Romeo and Juliet. It's different.
Yeah. Go ahead.
Sorry. I feel like at least a lot of I've read like 18th century like London stuff, and I feel like a lot of that is commenting on. I guess this is too. It's commenting on like the government and all that kind of stuff, and I feel like this is just more about like the self.
Yes.
Yeah.
Very good. Yes. One of the big differences between modern literature and Victorian literature is a focus on subjective personal experience. Yeah. Right. The Victorian writers often give you a big cast of characters and a kind of fully realized social world, right? Because what they're more interested in is that social world often than the thoughts, feelings, psychology of individual characters. But yeah, modernist writers are going to be much more devoted to kind of plumbing the depths of the interior, right? And yeah, we see, I think, more of that here. So yeah, it's a really good observation.
Right, like, I don't know, like Swift and, and all those people, it was just like, oh, London's dirty.
London's dirty, people are dirty, the human body is disgusting. Right?
Yeah, it was all just
that. So, a couple of things I want us to just kind of keep track of now, kind of as we read other things over the term, right? So, we also see in this novel a questioning of conventional morality. Though it does kind of snap back in a way at the end, as the obvious sinner is, really punishes himself for his crimes. We're encouraged also to consider the issues the novel raises from a multiplicity of perspectives, right? We're encouraged to look at Dorian, right? Not just from his own inner life, but through the eyes of Lord Henry, through the eyes of Basil Hallward, through the eyes of Sybil and James Vane, right? This is the wrong thing. It is also, on some level, a formal experiment with the novel, particularly in the way it joins together art theory and art criticism with fiction, right? Not always cleanly, and not always in a way that isn't a little clunky, but there is an attempt here to integrate art criticism into the novel form. And finally, the way it treats art as a kind of self-contained object for contemplation is something that we're going to see as kind of distinctly modern. So this is all I have for y'all today. Let me give you the reading questions for Shaw, who, like Wilde, is Anglo-Irish, though of a slightly more humble background. In fact, this is a modern British literature course, but only